good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in the world, whichever part of the day it is. Welcome to today's talk, Meet the Real Indiana Jones. I'm Justin Jacobs, professor of history at American University, and our topic today is Hollywood versus history. If you ever wondered, the Indiana Jones film franchise. If you ever wondered, perhaps, how much of this is based on real history? What were real-life archaeological expeditions actually like? Did Indiana Jones, or the historical version of Indiana Jones, did he actually compete with Nazis? All of this sort of stuff. These are the sort of questions that we're going to address today. Both a little bit of the film franchise itself to understand the inspiration for it, where the ideas came from, whether or not there's any real history involved in the creative process. I can give you a little spoiler right now. There's none, but we'll get into the details of that. But we're also going to spend a lot of time on sort of just what were archaeological expeditions in history actually like. I think the answer is probably going to surprise you. So without further ado, meet the real Indiana Jones. Let's start with a Hollywood refresher. All right, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones film from 1981, we learn that in the year 1936, that's the historical setting, 1936, Indiana Jones is said to recover a golden idol from Peru. He outruns an oversized boulder and beats the Nazis to the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt. My question that I always like to start off when we talk about this film is, what is the least plausible part of this description? And the answer, well, they're all pretty implausible. Let me let you in on a little bit of secret here. They're all pretty implausible, but actually this is a trick question that is supposed to surprise you. So for now, let's only highlight the least plausible element of the year 1936. Indiana Jones recovers a golden idol from Peru, outruns an oversized boulder, and beats the Nazis to the Ark of the Covenant. The least plausible element of this, sorry, it was a trick question, I warned you, it's the year. It's not any of the actual plot lines. It's the year 1936. That is actually by far the least plausible element of this entire film. By 1936, there were very few places left in the world that real-life archaeologists could have been doing the sort of things that Indiana Jones does in these films. All right, and certainly not in Egypt or Peru, where the majority of the action for these films takes place. By 1936, the historical Indiana Jones had already been kicked out of most of his old stomping grounds, including all of the major ones: Egypt, Peru, Turkey, China. In fact, if we want to know what the real-life Indiana Jones was actually doing in the mid-1930s, then we need to take a look into the pages of the Saturday Evening Post. Almost the exact same time period, 1937, just 1 year after Indiana Jones was said in Raiders of the Lost Ark to be doing all the fantastic things that he does, we find here in the pages of the popular periodical, the Saturday Evening Post, a cartoon by a cartoonist known as David Huffine. And in this cartoon, to us, of course, it's probably shocking to see something like this. To our sensibilities today, this is cringeworthy in almost every conceivable way. You have here the mocking of perceived African-American speech patterns, but generally the whole comic is supposed to inspire in its readership, in the audience, people who are, middle to upper class white men, most likely, in major metropolitan cities in North America and in Europe. It's just supposed to be funny. And in 1937, it probably would have elicited laughter from the readership of the Saturday Evening Post. But essentially, the message that we take away from this is that in 1937, this was the state of Western views of the business of archaeology. Expeditions were what white-skinned men did in uncivilized places, not the other way around. And it's mocking the idea that non-Westerners, people with darker skin, obviously here, the men in the canoe supposed to be portrayed as savages from a distant land, maybe the jungles of Brazil or the forest of Africa, perhaps. It's absurd, is what they're saying. It's absurd to think that they would be coming to a civilized place to be doing an expedition in America. That's not how it works. Expeditions are what? Civilized white men do in uncivilized, dark-skinned countries. Now, how do we know this cartoon is representative of the condescending, racist views of the real-life historical Indiana Jones? Because I found it cut out and placed in a letter in the archives of Roy Chapman Andrews at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. That was his institutional home where he worked as a paleontologist. Roy Chapman Andrews often undertook paleontological expeditions into China and Mongolia in search of early humanoids fossilized skeletons. He didn't find many of those. He ended up finding fossilized dinosaur eggs and sort of built his fame and mainstream popularity on that. And what I found is I actually found this cartoon in his files at the American Museum of Natural History. It was enclosed inside a letter sent to him by the Harvard art historian Langdon Warner. Langdon Warner. Both of these men had been obstructed in their expeditions in China in the late 1920s. Langdon Warner undertook an infamous expedition to the northwestern oasis of Dunhuang in 1924, peeled away many cave murals, and then was surprised the next year to find out, oh, the local Chinese peasants didn't want you to peel away the murals of their Buddhist and Taoist gods, and they're quite upset. And he wasn't able to do any more expeditions. So both these men have something in common. 10 years prior to the Huffine cartoon, where Langdon Warner is mailing this to his friend in New York so they can both get a good laugh, they're laughing at their own misfortune 10 years ago. They're taking solace in this cartoon that shows to them the absurdity of anyone other than a civilized white man doing a scientific expedition. So, to return to my trick question, if 1936 is not a plausible year for the chronological backdrop of the Indiana Jones film franchise, how far back do we have to go to put Harrison Ford and Indiana Jones back into their historical comfort zone? When could they have done the things that we see Indiana Jones doing in the film franchise? In other words, just how far off were Lucas and Spielberg? Just a couple of years? Well, that's innocent. Was it 5 years? No. The answer is, and we'll understand this over the course of today's lecture, at least 25 years. To really do what they're doing, you got to go back maybe 125 years to the early 19th century. So, that said, let's go back to the beginning and understand how the Western archaeological enterprise began, how it ended, and just how utterly ignorant George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were about pretty much everything we're going to cover tonight, and why the Indiana Jones film franchise contains not a kernel, not an ounce of historical information about real life archaeologists. This is a surprise. You go online, you type in the real Indiana Jones and whatnot, and you will find various websites saying, oh, this guy is the inspiration. This guy's the inspiration. Nonsense. None of them are the inspiration, and I will tell you why over the course of today's lecture. After today's lecture, I guarantee you, you will be far more qualified to write the next screenplay for the next Indiana Jones film, Indiana Jones 5, which is apparently in the works right now, than even the most accomplished Hollywood screenwriter. At least from an historical perspective, you will be far more qualified than even the most accomplished Hollywood screenwriter. You will also, I hope, be able to challenge some fairly simplistic but commonplace assumptions that you will see in mainstream intellectual thought. What are we looking at right now? We're looking at a meme that was created during the Capitol riots in early January of 2021, a very infamous event. Everyone should be, immediately know what I'm talking about. I'm based in Washington, D.C., so this is something that also hit very close to home to me as well. And on social media, I remember seeing images like this. This is one of them. Captured the screen of this image. Obviously, we all have seen this before, this image of one of the rioters taking away Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's lectern, with the caption added in, 19th century Western archaeologist. And it's supposed to be funny, and it is kind of funny. But what is the assumption here? The assumption here, when we're mocking this, is sort of the inverse of the Huffine cartoon from the Saturday Evening Post in the 1937. It's still mocking people who were involved in archaeological expeditions and excavations, but sort of flipping around who's being mocked in this case. It's not the dark-skinned natives who are being mocked here. Now we're mocking the white-skinned archaeologist and sort of taking him off of his pedestal. Literally, that's a pun just came to me right at the moment. I did not plan that. And And the idea here is that, oh, this is how all these items got into Western museums. It was simply the case of more powerful people walking into foreign countries. They weren't welcome. They didn't want them to be there. They used coercion and violence, as we see with the rioters, and then removed things without permission and took them away. And that's what happened. That's sort of what defines the Western archaeological enterprise. And it's all sort of delegitimized. It was a criminal enterprise. And that is, in various forms, the default mainstream intellectual assumption about Western archaeological expeditions. Was coercion and deceit and corruption involved sometimes? Oh, absolutely. Are they responsible for the exodus of treasures in all times and all places into Western museums? Absolutely not. There's a lot more going on here, and I want us to think about this in more nuanced terms, and that's my goal, to inject nuance into this debate and understand what was the real historical Indiana Jones like. Okay, so let's begin with the definition of the historical Indiana Jones. Who was he? Well, my own research, I do a lot of research on this topic. I've sort of come up with my own working explanation, definition. Basically, anyone who transports artifacts over ethnic and cultural boundaries in the name of science and empire. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's actually quite clear. There's several different elements to it, and we're going to break down each one of those elements. All right, one more time. Anyone who transports artifacts over ethnic and cultural boundaries in the name of science and empire. All right, let's dive in to each element of that definition. Let's begin with artifact. All right, an artifact. What is an artifact? You have objects, you have old objects, things you might dig out of the ground in an archaeological excavation. When does something become an artifact? An artifact, as opposed to just sort of an object, we are projecting a subjective human intellectual agenda upon an object to turn it into an artifact. An artifact is something that's going to go into a museum. All right, it's going to go into a museum. It's going to be curated and put on display. That's what distinguishes it in our definition here from just any old object. All right, the fact that it's being collected with the express purpose of putting it in some sort of a scientific institution that's going to preserve it and display it for educational purposes. That's why I say transporting artifacts, not just transporting objects, transporting artifacts across cultural and ethnic boundaries that are destined to go into a very particular type of institution. All right, so what about that institution? If to have an artifact, we need a museum as the ultimate destination, where do modern museums come from? The public museum that so many of us are familiar with. Most of you have probably visited museums. Many of the wonderful moments in my life are memories of walking through these huge museums. What we're really asking here is, when do we move beyond the privately owned, exclusive art collections of rich people, which have existed since time immemorial? There have always been rich people who collect beautiful works of art, things commissioned from craftsmen that are just exquisite. Paid a lot of money for this stuff. Very rare, very valuable. But it's exclusive. It's their own collection, and you can't see it without their permission, and it's not being necessarily actively studied and displayed for intellectual digestion. Okay, so when do we move beyond the privately owned, exclusive art collections of rich people, which, as we said, have always existed, to publicly accessible, inclusive collections that are intended to educate the general masses? That's the modern museum. The idea of the modern public museum emerged in the middle of the 18th century, the 1750s. And the earliest experiment, might surprise you, was an outdoor museum. The earliest experiment was the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum, the two major sites. Pompeii is much more has the name brand recognition. Herculaneum was actually the first excavations that began in 1738. You're looking here at a contemporary 18th century drawing of the excavations at the Temple of Isis, an Egyptian cult temple in the city, the buried city of Pompeii. Here you have your gentleman off here in the distance doing no labor whatsoever. You even have their little dog, while you have the lower class masses doing all the hard physical labor. So the excavations at Herculaneum began in 1738 and then eventually incorporated Pompeii by 1750 as well. What was going on here? Well, originally, King Charles of the House of Bourbon had taken over the title of King of the Two Sicilies. You don't need to know all about European history, but it's the Spanish House of Bourbon. He inherits and then additionally conquers some land in modern-day Italy. It didn't include all of Italy, though. The boundaries were different back then. And he gets the Bay of Naples as part of his territory. And when he takes up residence in Naples, he decides to build a brand new palace for himself, the Portici Palace. And he says, what are we going to decorate the Portici Palace with? Well, I've heard that there are wonderful, rare Roman antiquities that from time to time the local people in these cities have uncovered inadvertently while digging for wells. Wouldn't it be great if I could have Roman antiquities that no other monarch in Europe has? And so he says, let's dig some holes around here and see if we can find this buried city. And to do this, he wasn't interested initially in sort of preserving anything for scientific or educational purposes. He was interested only in filling his Portici Palace with beautiful, rare antiquities that would awe and impress all of his aristocratic guests and sort of shroud him in the indirect glory of the Roman Empire and say, look, I'm a better connoisseur than you are. You've never seen a Roman statue like this, have you? And they would all be red with envy. All right. But we know he wasn't interested in any sort of preservation because the people that he hired, the military engineers who were actually overseeing the digs, after they dug out a room, an ancient room in a house in Herculaneum or Pompeii, they would fill it back in with the soil. They would actually fill it back in with the soil. Or sometimes they would even destroy things if they realized this is a mural on the wall. We can't remove this. We don't have the technology to take this to the Portici Palace. They would deface it. Why? To make sure no one else got a hold of this, because if they did, it would devalue what the king had in the Portici Palace. Now, you're saying, I thought you said Pompeii and Herculaneum were going to be sort of the first precursors of the modern museum and preservation and display for education. This doesn't sound like that at all. You're right, it's not. But in 1750, a new military engineer takes over oversight of the excavations here. It's a Swiss-German engineer by the name of Carl Jacob Weber. He takes over for the previous guy, who was a Spanish military engineer named Alcubierre. Carl Jacob Weber takes over and suggests that we stop backfilling the holes that we've dug with soil and preserve the site for an educational purpose. He doesn't really use these terms, but he's basically saying, could we have an outdoor museum? An outdoor museum in which people, he's probably not thinking the general masses right now, but people, scholars and whatnot, could visit. And they could see these things in their original context. And we could learn about it and undertake real scholarship. And he starts digging stuff out and he gets criticism. Other people are saying, what are we doing this for? This is such a waste of effort. All we want are beautiful new antiquities for the Portici Palace so the king can brag and show off to all of his aristocratic friends and jealous monarchs. That's all we really want here. Weber's idea doesn't really prevail. He makes a little bit of progress, but his idea that you should preserve the ancient past and display it for educational purposes of a wider audience, not necessarily the exclusive property of some wealthy man, that idea will take root elsewhere, almost at the exact same time. Weber takes over the excavations at Pompeii in 1750. That's also the exact same year that you start getting stirrings in Paris about new institutions, new museum institutions that will preserve things. The first one you get is the Luxembourg Gallery. It also opens up in 1750. It's sort of a halfway point between the old, exclusive, rich collections that we used to see and the Louvre Museum, or the British Museum, which is where the story is going to end up at. The first modern museum, as we think of it today, is the Louvre. It's the Louvre in Paris. When does it open? It opens in 1793. Now, the idea for the Louvre was actually from the ill-fated King Louis XVI. but he didn't get it ready in time. And as a result, he ended up losing his head, and the Louvre never actually opened up under his tenure as monarch. His revolutionary successors, who ordered his execution, took over the project. And they said, you know what, this is a really useful project. We want to cultivate some sort of political legitimacy, cultural legitimacy with the general masses. This is going to be a very useful thing to do. Open a museum, invite the general masses in, and say, we're educating you about your past and introducing you to higher, refined works of art, and thus improving your lives, your knowledge of the world. Here you're seeing contemporary paintings of what the Louvre looked like in late 18th and early 19th century. So both Louis XVI and his revolutionary successors were constructing the Louvre for basically the same reason: to ingratiate themselves with the general masses by advertising themselves as the sponsors of the Enlightenment ideals of science, preservation, and education. All right, that's the discourse that surrounds the modern public museum. More cynically, and I'm all for cynicism, anyone who knows me knows that I'm one of the most cynical guys around. More cynically, we can say that the modern museum represents a form of money laundering. All right, money laundering. What do I mean by money laundering? What I mean is that it is an institution that is all about lofty, abstract aims. All right, a good public mission. We are improving the morals, the knowledge of the general masses who don't have too many opportunities to learn about their history and all this sort of stuff, other cultures and everything. We are improving them by opening up the art and antiquities of the entire world to them and educating them. That's the public discourse. But what's really going on is that the museum oftentimes will serve as a means by which really rich people are able to launder their money into cultural and social respectability. Most wealthy people, I'm talking crazy wealthy, okay, billionaires and whatnot. You don't get to be a billionaire without cracking a few heads, all right? You think about the 19th century robber barons, they have that nickname for a reason, all right? The people who were in charge of building railroads, steel, coal, all of these sorts of things. I mean, these were, fabulously wealthy men who had made their fortunes through many cutthroat means. Okay. And we know that when they were trying to say, you know what, I don't have a very good reputation. How am I sort of crack down on strikes in my factory, the poor downtrodden people. How do I improve my public image? Museums would allow them to improve their public image. And that's actually one of the chief attractions of the institution of the modern museum for really rich people. You say, I'll donate, I'll put a lot of my money in here, and in exchange, I'll get my name on a plaque, or maybe the name of the museum itself. I believe this is the Arthur Sackler Gallery. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But even if it's not, I think it is though. It's a wonderful example. The Freer and Sackler Gallery in downtown DC on the National Mall. I go there all the time. I never really gave much thought to who Freer, Charles Freer, or Sackler was. I just assumed passively, oh, these must be good guys. Their name's on the building. Of course they must agree and subscribe and reinforce the whole mission of the museum, which has a very positive impression to me. And then in recent years, we hear all this horrible, awful stuff about the opioid crisis and the Sackler family and their association with these sort of, pretty sinister means of making a lot of money at the expense of the common people. There were even debates: should we remove the Sackler name from some of the institutions that they have their name on? The whole point of this was it's a means of money laundering for rich people. Okay, put your name up in a prominent public sphere that will be seen by everyone, and it'll be seen in a very positive light. That's the role that the museum often plays for very rich people. However, I don't want to be too cynical. The agenda of museums serving as sort of a clearinghouse to pursue science, education, and preservation is very real. All right, it's motivated by a desire to demonstrate mastery over the natural processes of decay. That's one of the Enlightenment agendas. Nature's cruel. Nature doesn't care if we live or die. Nature will naturally allow art and antiquity to decay, deteriorate, and disappear, turn into dust over time if we don't halt the natural process. And part of the scientific pursuit in the 18th century was, how do we arrest this process? How do we take some control of our fate, and stop the process of decay, make ourselves immortal in a sense? Even if our bodies will eventually die, we can have influence beyond the generations through knowledge, through scientific knowledge. And that was what was going on at places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, in the Luxembourg Gallery, and then eventually fully embodied in the modern museum like the Louvre, the British Museum. We are going to take paintings that should no longer exist. It's 100 years old, 200 years old. I mean, these things deteriorate. They're not going to last that long. We're going to arrest the natural processes of decay through our scientific ingenuity so that this can last forever for the benefit of future generations of the masses. And once we arrest the process of natural decay, preserve it forever, against the dictates of nature, which would naturally cause this thing to turn into dust after a couple hundred of years, we are going to wring didactic value out of it all for teaching purposes, to improve the morals of the general public, the poor illiterate masses who come in. We're going to improve them through the public museum. Right? I often like to make the analogy that modern museums are kind of similar to zoos. Museums are to the world of art and artifacts what zoos are to the natural world, which is essentially you take something that has a different meaning in its original context. This was just a fork that was once used in a pragmatic sense to eat breakfast with. Throw it in the ground, bury it for 1,000 years, uncover it, put it into a museum behind a glass case, put a placard on it explaining its educational value, and all of a sudden, it is an embodiment of the Enlightenment agenda of science, preservation, and education to improve the knowledge of the general masses. And, showcase you as an enlightened sponsor of an institution that undertakes such an educational agenda. But that fork has a very different meaning now in its new context from its original meaning as a utilitarian function to put food into your mouth. Zoos are quite similar with the biological world. You take animals or any sort of specimen of the natural world that is in danger of going extinct, disappearing in its original natural environment. It has a different meaning to human beings in that original context. A panda bear in the upland forest, bamboo forest of Sichuan province in China is an economic resource. You may hunt it, you may eat it, but you are not viewing it as people in major cities in Washington, D.C., Beijing are going to be taught to view the panda bear. Once you remove it from its context, put it into a zoo and say, we are preserving this from the natural processes of decay. Without our intervention, this will go extinct. We have intervened in a benevolent sense. We put it in a new institution that serves the same function as museums, but for the natural world. We will prevent this. We will overcome nature. We will prevent this from going extinct and, sort of rear it and cultivate this specimen for all time. All right. And it has a new meaning. Now the panda is a symbol of the conservation movement. It's a symbol of a new sort of relationship that humans are supposed to have with the natural world that would be utterly unfamiliar to the people who originally lived in the vicinity of that panda bear and saw it chiefly as an economic resource, maybe even as a pest nuisance. The meaning has radically changed by inserting this thing into the new museum that represents Enlightenment ideals. So the zoo and the modern museum are actually very similar in that way. So back to our definition of the historical Indiana Jones, transporting artifacts across ethnic and cultural boundaries in the name of science and empire. The museum is what justifies the transport of objects across ethnic and cultural boundaries. Anyone who isn't practicing science, education, and preservation, or at least claiming to be practicing those things, is supposed to let those who do practice these ideals remove the hidden gems in their midst. Because you don't recognize the true value of this. You're going to let it go extinct. You're going to let nature take its course. And I'm not going to do that. I recognize that there's hidden value to humanity in preserving this, removing it from this context where you're going to let it be destroyed or maybe actively destroy it. And I'm going to put it into a museum for the benefit of the whole world. Okay. This distinguishes in the historical archaeological enterprise, this is what distinguishes so-called legitimate scholars from tomb raiders or treasure seekers who are said to only seek personal profit, not to have a loftier agenda for the general public. Right? it also distinguishes one empire from another. Each empire is going to compete in the 18th and 19th century to build the most complete museum, thus confirming their claim to the title of the most civilized and enlightened empire. All right, the French, the British, the German will all be competing to make sure their showcase public museum is the best, the most complete. Undertakes the Enlightenment mission of preservation, education, and scientific research for the general public, for the nation. We do that mission, we complete that mission better than any other empire. All right, so remember, when Indiana Jones says his feel-good line, and most people don't realize this line doesn't actually come to the third film in the series, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The first two films, he never says this line. They sort of belatedly come to the value of this line. When he says that belongs in a museum, he's being slightly disingenuous, all right? He's promoting the first goal, the Enlightenment agenda of science, preservation, and education. That's what this line is supposed to invoke. That's what makes him the good guy. And the other guys who have bloodied up his chin here, the bad guys, because they don't subscribe to that lofty agenda. But he's obscuring the petty jealousies that are inherent in the second distinction about political rivalries among empires. All right, that is to say, he's eagerly and publicly distinguishing himself from treasure seekers, such as the guys who are beating him up here, the bad guys, while slyly glossing over the fact that what he really means is not that belongs in a museum. What he really means is that belongs in my museum. Don't forget that. All right? That is what Indiana Jones, if he was being truly honest in the third film, that's what he really means. It belongs in my museum, not a museum. Now, how did archaeological expeditions work? That is to say, how did they manage to succeed so consistently in transporting so many artifacts across so many ethnic and cultural boundaries? Well, you have to admit, when you look over the about 150 years from Napoleon to the Nazis, and when Napoleon first, invades Egypt and some of his savants, his scholars that he brings with him, starts removing some of the Egyptian cultural objects, all the way until Nazi expeditions in the 1930s and early 1940s. You got to admit, from any objective perspective, they are successful in achieving their aims. We went out into the world to remove cultural objects from different countries and bring them back home to our museums, and they did that a lot. How are they so successful? Now, you may not want to put a positive spin on that success today. You may say, well, that's a morally dubious enterprise, but you can't deny that from their perspective and on their criteria, it was pretty darn successful. That's how the museums got so full. How did this happen? This is the research question that I've sort of posed to myself and tried to answer for the past 15 years. The most surprising part of the answer to this question is that the use of military force or other forms of coercion was actually exceedingly rare. Generally speaking, outside of the relatively rare military looting operations, there's a few of those, but not as many as you think. The historical Indiana Jones did not shoot his way into other countries, nor did he get shot out when he started being said, you can't do this anymore. Okay? This is why I often like to say, the historical Indiana Jones was able to undertake excavations when people in the host country said yes. When he asked for permission, can I come in and do an expedition? And they said yes. He went in and took what he wanted. When finally, in the 1920s and 1930s, they began to say no, he stopped. It was as simple as that. But why did they say yes? And why did they say no? Of course, that's a bigger question. But it isn't necessarily the passive default assumption that we have in mainstream intellectual thought today that Western archaeological expeditions were so successful because of deceit, corruption, and coercion. They were deceiving the natives. They were coercing them with force or the threat of force, or they were bribing them. It was corrupt. That's our default assumption. Okay? But if you critically examine that default assumption and go back and try to reconstruct the logistics of what actually happened, you're going to be quite surprised. And that's what we're going to do. Right, remember, museums don't have armies, and no empire goes to war just so they can loot art and antiquities. Now, once war is declared for other reasons, Sometimes you will have military plunder that ensues. Like I said, however, it's relatively rare when you look at the whole big picture in the aggregate of expeditions and excavations over a 150, 200-year period. Now, expeditions and excavations were massively complex logistical undertakings, as you can see here with Giovanni Belzoni's removal of the Memnon head from Luxor in Egypt. Not too far from the Valley of the Kings. Belzoni is not depicted here. These are his local Egyptian Arab laborers that he has hired to help move the head to the Nile River so he can remove it to England. All right, but these were massively complex logistical undertakings. All right, they required diplomatic paperwork, daily provisions, local labor, the hiring of local labor, and sometimes physical protection. Because oftentimes you're going into fairly remote regions where the host country who is hosting you doesn't even necessarily have complete control of the frontier regions that you're going into. The reason these things still exist in the sand is because not many people really live there oftentimes, or they ignore it. And so you're off in some pretty remote regions where harm could befall you. Right? So there's a lot to consider. How do you undertake all of these logistics? The vast majority of archaeological operations were very straightforward in their approach. They applied to local officials for permission to dig, and they were usually given that permission to dig. I know that's a really anticlimactic answer. What? That's it? They asked for permission, and then they were given permission? Yes, they did. That's how it usually worked. But why? Didn't the locals realize that priceless artifacts were being removed in untold numbers? The answer might surprise you. Yes, they realized objects are being removed. They weren't morons. They saw it. These things are huge. Look at this thing. It's enormous. You can't smuggle that out of the country in your back pocket. This thing weighs 6 tons. Look at all the people who are involved in its removal. They know what's going on. They realized the objects are being removed, but they didn't regard them as priceless. They didn't regard them as priceless. Remember, it is the institution of the museum that turns a worthless, rusty fork into a priceless historical artifact by infusing the Enlightenment agenda of science, preservation, and education into it for the glory of the empire that sponsored that museum and that expedition. Without museums, these objects are valued by the locals. The locals are right here, you can see them, very differently. They're seen as either worthless, profitable, or precious, but not priceless. What we have here is a favorable exchange rate for the Westerners. All right, they're taking advantage of a favorable exchange rate. So if you want to compare them to thieves, that's fine, but a better analogy would be more to like, shady Wall Street dealings in which people are manipulating exchange rates to their benefit. All right, it's more like that than it is sort of going in with guns blazing and stealing things on the threat of force. Now, what I'm going to present here are the results of my own research, because I've been spending 15 years going into this and saying, how did these things work? How could so much stuff be removed with clearly the full knowledge of the locals? They knew what was going on, and it's clear that force was not usually applied or almost ever applied, at least not as the chief motivation in undertaking an archaeological expedition. All right. Now, the results of my research are what I refer to in my book. Sorry for the plug, but hey, this is the work that I've been doing, and this is the book that it all sort of comes into and is embodied by. I call it the Compensations of Plunder framework, which is my tongue-in-cheek way of actually saying the compensations of cooperation. Because once you reconstruct the original perspectives of people who were involved in these expeditions, you realize that they didn't regard it as plunder at the time. Plunder is a retroactive valuation that later generations would foist upon these expeditions when values changed. At the time, this was the compensations of cooperation. Right? It involved the voluntary exchange of various forms of resources or compensations, or what I refer to as capital in my research. Various forms of capital whose value is perceived as greater than that which is being removed in that time and place by that particular people, not by us today, because we all have been reared and trained and raised to regard all this stuff as priceless. That's our valuation today. That wasn't the valuation of everyone involved in these expeditions 100, 150 years ago. Right? We need to reconstruct their original perspective. And what they realized is that we can get resources from the Western archaeologist, and all he wants in exchange are these things that we regard as less valuable than what he's giving us. Okay? To the real life Indiana Jones, it was the artifact that was perceived as priceless because it embodied the Enlightenment agenda of science, preservation, and education, and it also was a symbol of the political glory of his empire. Nothing is more valuable than that. That's why it's priceless. It symbolized his nation, or the glory of his nation in collecting the objects of other nations. Okay? But to the non-Western locals who operated under very different economic, cultural, and political circumstances, it was the relationship you had with a resourceful Western agent of a powerful Western empire that was perceived as priceless. In other words, it was the relationship with the archaeologist that was priceless, not the object that he wanted to remove that was priceless. The archaeologist was the golden goose who kept on producing golden eggs. The goose who produces golden eggs, not the golden goose. All right. That was the golden goose. I did it again. That was the goose who kept producing over and over and over again. All right. Let's flush this out. I know you're thinking, this is all very abstract. All right. Let's flush it out. What sort of compensations were tendered in exchange for cooperation in an archaeological excavation or an expedition? I have several that I'm going to talk about: diplomatic capital, political capital, social capital, and economic capital. Let's start with diplomatic capital. Here is your contemporary painting of the removal of the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon on the mountainous outcropping known as the Acropolis in the city of Athens. Why is this a symbol of diplomatic capital? This is a very contentious removal of what are now known as the Elgin marbles, ancient Greece. All right, various sculpture, a sculptural program that was originally up here along this area, all the way around the building, removed by Lord Elgin in the first couple of years of the early 19th century, or removed by his men. This is a form of diplomatic capital. Athens, Greece, was a part of the Ottoman Empire at the time this was going. It was not independent. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, or Turks, who are, it's largely governed by Turks, they are mostly Muslims. Okay? Even the Greeks who live in Greece in the early 19th century, the vast majority of them are Orthodox Christians. Okay? But all this is to say there's a vast cultural disconnect between ancient Greece, the pagan ancient Greeks, and the modern day Christian Orthodox Greeks, and the Muslim Turks who rule the Ottoman Empire. Now, why is he able to do this? He's not doing this in the stealth of night where no one sees what he's doing. This is done in the open, daylight of a regular day. The locals are being hired to help him. Note the Turkish dress here. He's not doing this without the knowledge of the local Ottoman authorities and the population of Greece. Do you see any tanks here? Do you see any guns? No, you do not. So how is this happening? Because today, this is widely regarded as theft. Clearly, coercion, corruption, or deceit must have been involved. No. It did not have the priceless valuation that modern day Greeks have been educated to believe that they should have, as we now have a one-to-one connection with the ancient Greek people. They represent us over, a distance of 2,000 years. They are us. And you gloss over all the cultural changes. There was a cultural disconnect, a perception of cultural discontinuity. And the Ottomans clearly had a perception of cultural discontinuity. We're Muslims. This is ancient pagan Greeks. There's some respect for the accomplishments of the ancient Greeks, but still, it's not our culture. The Acropolis, the entire rocky outcropping, had been turned into a military base. It was a military installation. This is a mosque. Right here, this is a mosque. It's not there anymore. It was torn down later on. But the Parthenon had actually been turned into a mosque by the Turks, so their soldiers could do their worshiping services while they were posted on top of the Acropolis. But it was also a military installation because they don't view ancient Greek and ancient Greek architecture as priceless. It wasn't priceless to them at the time. And so they use it as a military base. And Lord Elgin, who is he? Well, he's a British aristocrat who is appointed to be the first permanent ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from the British Empire. And the context is Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Egypt is also, like Greece, a province of the Ottoman Empire. It's theirs. Napoleon had invaded Egypt, hoping to sort of cut off access to the Red Sea and what will eventually become the Suez Canal. You had a little overland route that you used to have to go on, but that was the quickest route to get to India back then, British India. And Napoleon's hoping to cut off that route, invades Egypt. Well, the Ottomans don't like this. This is their province. Do they have the ability to defeat Napoleon and kick him out of their province of Egypt? No, they don't. Do the British want to kick Napoleon out of Egypt for their own selfish reasons? Absolutely. Yes, they do. Are they going to couch their struggle with Napoleon in terms of, we want to help out the Ottomans and we're just doing this to be your good friend? Of course they will. And that's what happens. That's what happens. The British go in. They have the ability to defeat Napoleon. They fight battles with Napoleon in Egypt, kick him out. And as they're doing this, Lord Elgin is the most important man in Constantinople because he is the permanent ambassador. He is the living flesh and blood embodiment of the British alliance with the Ottoman Empire. They're all being very selfish. The Ottomans just want Egypt back. The British just want to kick the French out. But the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so they're a temporary alliance. Whatever Lord Elgin wants, he's going to get. And Lord Elgin says, would it be possible to, remove, originally he just wants plaster casts, but he says, is it possible for my men to go on the Acropolis, it's a restricted military region, and take some plaster casts of the sculptural program on the top of the Parthenon? We would love to have some examples of this to take back to Britain. The Sultan says, yeah, go right ahead. We don't value this stuff. And you guys just give us back Egypt. Of course you can go there. He goes there. The local military governor, the Ottoman governor of Athens, says you can't go up to the Acropolis. It's a restricted military base. Elgin writes to the Sultan in Constantinople again and says, hey, your guys on the ground aren't giving us my men access. The Sultan says, you better give them access or you're going to be sent as a slave in the galleys because we want to please this man. All he wants to do is go up and look at ancient Greek pagan sculpture. So the local military authority says, okay, I'm so sorry. Go up and do it. Of course you can. And Lord Elgin's men on the ground said, you know what? He's so chastened, he's so terrified that I think now you could even ask for the originals, not plaster casts, and he might let you take him away. They ask, he says, sure. And in full sight, they remove over 100 tons of ancient Greek marble from the Parthenon, which later becomes the Elgin marbles. Okay. The lesson to take away from all this, the Elgin marbles are your quintessential example of diplomatic capital. Ancient Greek sculpture is not regarded by the Ottoman authorities who rule Greece at this time period as priceless. It's not even regarded by the local Greeks as priceless. Although even if they did, that wouldn't matter. What matters is who's in authority. And that's the Ottomans in Constantinople. This is precious at most. Probably not even precious, probably a few steps below precious. This is mostly a military base to the Ottomans. And he says, what we got in exchange for this is Egypt. And all he wants are some sculptures from pagan Greeks who go to hell. Literally, in the theology of Islam and Christianity, the pagan Greeks are in purgatory and hell. Okay, if you didn't know that, that's all he wants is emblems of them. Of course, give him whatever the hell he wants. He gave us back Egypt. That's the true price of the Elgin marbles. It's Egypt. Okay, it's Egypt. That is what was truly exchanged for the Elgin marbles. The return of Egypt to the Ottoman Empire. We forget these. We have to reconstruct the original context. Another form of diplomatic capital, what are known as Cleopatras Needles. 3 different obelisks, and there's actually many more, and only 2 of them are technically called Cleopatra's Needles, but I want you to just use the whole term for this because I don't want to confuse you with nitty-gritty details. Cleopatra's Needles are a series of ancient Egyptian obelisks, like you're seeing here in this photograph. This is one that was given to the United States, is now in Central Park in New York. Cleopatra's Needles are a series of obelisks that were willingly, voluntarily, knowingly gifted away by successive sultans in Egypt who wanted to ingratiate themselves with Western powers. They wanted to say, we want to grease the wheels of diplomacy. We want you to lower the interest rates on a loan to build the Suez Canal. We'd like you to be in alliance with us, have a united front against Britain or France or whoever. Or thank you for your help in blah, blah, blah. Now, in exchange, we don't have any money to give you. We're a relatively poor country. But hey, here's these worthless Egyptian obelisks that we place almost no value on because we're Muslims and these are ancient pagans. Then we don't see much cultural connection between them and us. I see that you guys value these very highly. How about we give you an obelisk? Cost us nothing, but it's heavily valued by the other side. This is another form of classic diplomatic capital. And these obelisks are now, you can see them. You go to Paris, Place de la Concorde. There's one of them. That's from Luxor. There is one on the banks of the Thames River in London, and there's the one in Central Park in New York. Ironically, even though I'm based in the United States, I've seen the one in person in both Paris and London. I have not seen the one that's in America in Central Park. So anyways, another great example of diplomatic capital being exchanged. And we forget the original context, and we think coercion, deceit, deception must be involved. And when we go back and say, what was really going on? What were the real motivations on all sides? We realize, no, these were voluntary gifts from the, not sultans of Egypt, pashas of Egypt, in order to grease the wheels of diplomacy with something that cost them nothing, but was perceived as valuable by the person on the other side of the negotiating table. There's political capital. Political capital. Let's start off with Giovanni Belzoni and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is the Pasha of Egypt in the from roughly 1810 or so until his death. I believe he dies 1849. Anyways, 1810s, 20s, 30s, and some of the 40s. Muhammad Ali is the local Pasha in Egypt, mostly autonomous from the Ottoman Empire, but not formally broken away from the Ottoman Empire. Giovanni Belzoni is an Italian hydrologist who is tired of sort of doing undertaking hydraulic works for the stage, recreating naval battles in the theater, and being sort of a strong man himself, sometimes participating in the theater, putting 6 men on his back and walking around, sort of like a freak show. He's tired of that. He wants to try something new. Belzoni decides, he is contacted actually. Someone says, we'd like to make use of your talents in hydrology, making water do things that it wouldn't normally do in nature. All right. We'd like to take your talents in hydraulic expertise. Come to Egypt. Our Pasha, Muhammad Ali, is very interested in modernization. He wants to be able to increase agricultural productivity. By somehow creating a water pumping device that will allow the waters of the Nile to be pumped into more distant agricultural fields to increase agricultural productivity. Belzoni says, sure, this is my ticket out of the theater. He goes to Egypt. He deeply impresses Muhammad Ali with his modernization talents, his scientific knowledge. All right. This is going to be where you most often see political capital. It's not diplomatic capital. It's not sort of this horse trading, this for that. It's sort of this, I want to be seen as someone who is pursuing the foundation of scientific modernity, to catch up to the Western powers, to be able to have the scientific, technological ingenuity that they have, to have a stronger military, to increase agricultural yield and thus my taxes, so I can invest them in heavy industry and have sort of a navy and an army that can prevent foreign invasion like Napoleon. All right, that's political capital. All right, and anyone who is perceived as holding the secrets of the Western scientific industrial revolution, Western science, is going to be an esteemed guest who will be able to get things from the host country. Now, Giovanni Belzoni shows his water-saving device to the Pasha of Egypt. The Pasha decides not to take it because it breaks down too much. We don't have anyone who can really repair it. But thank you for coming and showing me this. It was very interesting. He was also very impressed with Belzoni's experiments with electricity. He actually shocked him at one point, and the Pasha was delighted to be shocked by electricity. He was impressed that Belzoni seemed to have so many of the secrets of Western scientific ingenuity, the building blocks of a modern country that's strong and powerful. He's sharing the secrets of this with us. And this is how Belzoni ingratiates himself with the Pasha, Muhammad Ali. So the Pasha is predisposed to treat him favorably. He's given him political capital. He has allowed Muhammad Ali to present himself to his subjects as someone who's interested in modernization and is trying to actively capture the secrets of Western science and make Egypt strong. That's political capital. And so he grants Belzoni all the assistance he needs to undertake an expedition. All you want in exchange, you want to go look for this 6-ton granite head of the ancient pagans who are all in hell today? Yeah, go right ahead. This is not controversial at the time it's going on. Here you can see the actual Memnon head. I noted, this is my own photograph of this. It's much smaller in person than it is in this photo. You can see here in Belzoni's own drawing. This is from 1816. In his own drawing, he has portrayed the Memnon head. Enormous! Look at this. It's like more than twice as tall, wide as a human being. In person, it's not nearly as big. It's still big. I'm not trying to, sort of rain on the Memnon's head parade, but Belzoni was trying to make it look like it was a much greater feat in removing it than it actually was. So that is a form of political capital. All right. Another form of political capital. The British archaeologist Oral Stein. This is who I do most of my own original research on. He goes to northwestern China. The old Silk Road undertakes 4 expeditions in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He does his first one in 1900. After he does his first expedition in 1900, he writes what is known as a preliminary report in English, sends a copy of the preliminary report to the local Chinese governor, a man by the name of Rao Yingqi, in 1901. In 1901, Governor Rao commissions a Chinese translation of Stein's English language preliminary report. He says, I want to know what Stein was doing in the sands of my province in northwestern China. And the translator, the Chinese translator who was commissioned to do this translation from English into Chinese, writes a preface in which we get a Chinese view of what Stein represents to the Chinese in 1902 is when it comes out, the Chinese translation. Not what he means to the Chinese in 2002, because he's a thief. In 1902, what did the Chinese translator of Stein's preliminary report say about Stein? You got to recapture the original voice, not our voice today, and then project it back in time. What did they think Stein symbolized to them? The translator, a man by the name of Wan Rong, says the following, quote, Mr. Stein is a highly refined gentleman, and he has spent 18 months incessantly climbing mountains, traversing rivers, and seeking out antiquities and ancient sites. The ignorant ones may ridicule his roundabout wanderings and take no notice of them. They all marvel at the natural sciences and are in awe of Western weapons and technology. Yet when it comes to seeing Mr. Stein crossing mountains and rivers or traveling through the desert, they laugh at his folly. This is just being ignorant. Why is this political capital? Wan Rong, the Chinese translator, is telling us Stein represents Western wealth and power, which is founded in science. He is an exemplar of Western science going in our own backyard right now, showing us the secrets of Western wealth and power. And the Chinese officials, my colleagues, you're all laughing at him. You're saying, how can a cultivated, educated gentleman go off into the sand and ford rivers and get his hands all dirty and whatnot? Look at this guy. He's crazy. You say, that's not the attitude you should have. The governor wants you to know that you should be admiring Stein. You should be emulating Stein, because this is the secret of Western wealth and power. And if you want to keep the Westerners at bay, you need to learn the secrets. And Stein is showing you the secrets right in front of your eyes. This is political capital. Same thing with Muhammad Ali and Giovanni Belzoni and him demonstrating the new water pump to get water from the Nile. You want to be seen as an agent of modernization? Here is an agent of modernization in your own backyard. And you want to show everyone, I'm on board with what this guy's showing us. All he wants in return is to take away some old Buddha heads and whatnot. Fine. Political capital is much more valuable than what he's removing from our territory. Okay. Now there's social capital. And again, a lot of my examples come from Oral Stein because I've done so much research on him. But you can find these things in other archaeological excavations and expeditions as well. What about the Chinese officials who met Stein? Here is one of them, Zhu Reichi. here in the middle, Stein's on the right. Zhu Reicher met Stein on 3 of his 4 expeditions to northwestern China. And we actually have letters that Zhu then later wrote. Here is a letter from Zhu Reicher to Stein, written in 1908 after Stein's 2nd expedition. I found this in Stein's archives. He had preserved the letter and put it in his papers before he died. There I found it in the Bodleian Library at Oxford in the summer of 2013 when I was doing a research trip there. It was, again, a wonderful opportunity to say, not what we think Stein was, because we now reflexively think of him as a thief. What did the Chinese, who facilitated his expeditions and allowed him to be successful, because without their help, there's no way you're doing an expedition. What did they think of him? Why did they help? Were they corrupt? Were they deceived? Were they threatened by force? No, no, and no. Here is Zhu Reicher's voice. Quote, "What I admire is your stern fortitude and valiant resolve. Everywhere you set your foot, dear sir, becomes famous, from the luster you confer on the sands of the Gobi to the distinction you confer on the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains." It's a social capital. Stein is a Western scientific celebrity on camelback. And once the governor has indicated you should all be emulating him, this is where we want to go. We want to be like Stein, be like Mike, be like Stein. They all follow in lockstep and say, now we are gushing about Stein. There's a scientific celebrity in our own backyard. I'm going to brag about meeting him. And it's a form of social capital. You ever bragged about meeting a celebrity? I do. I interviewed Alex Rodriguez when I was growing up in Seattle, and he was a rookie for the Mariners before he did all of his later stuff and his reputation suffered. He was an up-and-coming rookie. I went to the Kingdom and was able to get an interview with him for a local high school newspaper. I've talked about that my entire life. I met Alex Rodriguez. All right, you go out to dinner one time and you say, "Oh, there's Bill Gates." You're going to talk about that. Social capital. That's a thing. That's a thing, and you brag about it to other people. That's what we're seeing here with Stein. There's political capital and there's social capital. There's another one. Wang Ming, the son of a deceased Chinese official, Wang Changjun, who met Stein many times and regarded him as a friend. Wang Changjun, the guy who actually knew Stein, has died by the time that Stein's letter has reached his son in 1925. The son writes back to Stein about their relationship. And he says, quote, "Whenever I think of my late father, I recall how every time he chatted with his friends, he would suddenly change the topic to talk about your broad learning and thorough understanding of Eurasia. And he would narrate your travels in northwestern China. He singled out for particular praise your steadfast determination to succeed, despite untold sufferings unimaginable to others. Truly, these were things that no one else could measure up to." Social capital. Stein is someone you brag about knowing. Once the value of what he provides, this capital that we don't view as very valuable today, but it was viewed as priceless back then. Okay, this is the compensation that they're getting from helping Stein do his archaeological expedition. And then there's the local laborers. The often illiterate, poor, impoverished peasants, whether they're Arab peasants in Egypt, whether they're Chinese peasants in China, whatever it is. Why do they join in archaeological expeditions? Why do they help out? Why are they helping move the Memnon head for Giovanni Belzoni? Well, I have a letter from the Yale climatologist Ellsworth Huntington that I want to read an excerpt for you. They join chiefly for economic capital. All right, that's their incentive to join an archaeological expedition. They're poor. They're poor. They're not identifying with the objects that are being removed in any meaningful way. All right, because they aren't usually educated. And education is what instills a desire to identify with the material remains of the ancient past. If you're not educated, it's not a natural thing to look at something that's in the ground for 2,000 years and say, "Oh, my ancestors, I have an immediate connection with it." That's not natural. You have to be taught to believe that. And that teaching comes through education. You're not educated, you're poor, you care about your daily livelihood. So chiefly, they join for economic capital. Wages, which tended to be market rate or sometimes better than market rate. Rewards, you find me an extra bodhisattva's head and I'll give you an extra reward on top of your wages. And then there's a very interesting form of economic capital that I saw with in the letters of Ellsworth Huntington in northwestern China. Huntington has a local Muslim guide by the name of Daoud. Huntington gets an audience with the local Chinese governor. Right? He goes to the capital of the province and gets an audience with the local Chinese governor. Only Huntington can get this audience. Okay, in case you were wondering, no one, not just anyone can walk up and get an audience with the most powerful person in the entire province. You have to be someone who's regarded as, important, as the Western archaeologists are, because they have all those forms of capital that are desired by the host country. So he can get an audience with the governor. He brings Daoud into the audience with him and says to the governor, can you give him a promotion? He's been really good to me. I like him. Right? Is it possible you could improve his livelihood with a better job, more economic opportunities? And here's what we find in the letter. After asking the governor to give Daoud the job of village headman when he goes back home, the governor, quote, promised to do so, and when he called on me, asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, most horribly frightened, was brought in. And after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground 6 times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, one that he will boast of till his death. For as Ibrahim said, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the governor if he paid $5,000. Wonderful example. It's not just wages and rewards, it's the potential for promotion. The Western archaeologist, because he's providing valuable forms of capital that are perceived as more valuable than what he wants to remove, he's able to get audiences with very powerful, important local people that those lower down on the social scale can't have access to. It's all about who you know, right? He can bring them into the halls of power with him, give them his promotion, which carries much weight, and improve their life with a promotion. One of the other guys, Ibrahim, in Huntington's entourage, literally says, Daoud could not have procured an interview with the governor if he paid $5,000, an unimaginable sum of money back then. He actually puts an actual dollar amount on this, how valuable Huntington's connections are with the local leaders. That's economic capital. And there's some things that are kind of unclassifiable. I'm not really sure what to make of these, but something valuable is being exchanged. Here's the Frenchman Paul Pelliot, French sinologist, a brilliant scholar. He also does some expeditions to one expedition to northwestern China. I remember going through his diary. At one point, he's talking about a conversation he has with a local, an elderly Muslim man. And he says, this man's always talking about all the women that he's had, relationships with over his entire life. Kind of a lecherous old man. And at one point, all of a sudden, in Pelliot's diary, he says, he asked me if I can give him a summer of St. Martin from my pharmacy bag. And I had no idea what a summer of St. Martin is. I had to look this up. Turns out that's the French equivalent of the English saying Indian summer. What is an Indian summer? It's unseasonably warm weather late in the year after you would no longer expect such warm weather. It's supposed to be cooling down into fall and winter. And I realized summer of St. Martin. This guy is asking, do you have unseasonably warm weather in your pharmacy bag that you can give me? And it suddenly occurred to me, in context of all the discussion of his conquest of women and whatnot, the elderly Muslim man was asking him, do you have the equivalent of Viagra, the early 19th century, early 20th century equivalent of Viagra? That's what he's asking for. Right? That's another compensation. It's kind of a funny one, right? And you think, can you believe it? This is what is being tendered in exchange for local cooperation, and is being viewed as more valuable by this man than what Pelliot is taking away. What is Pelliot taking away? Ancient Buddhist objects, mostly. This guy is an elderly Muslim man. These objects, he exists in a state of a perception of cultural discontinuity with them, just like the Ottomans in ancient Greece, or Muhammad Ali in ancient Egypt, and those obelisks he was willing to give away. All right, so the next time you're in a museum and you see something on display, and someone asks you, "How did this thing get here? This was theft, right?" You say, "No, no, no. I listened to Professor Jacobs' lecture on Meet the Real Indiana Jones. The real answer is boner pills. Boner pills were what was being exchanged for this bodhisattva's head." All right. We can actually see this inadvertently. The Indiana Jones films, sometimes they do regurgitate things that actually happened, or at least some of the big themes. I think it's often unconscious, not really deliberate. They don't realize this stuff actually happened. But nevertheless, this is one scene from the third film, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. They're in the Republic of Hatay, I think 1938, 1939, and the Nazis want to get permission to go into the deserts of this Middle Eastern country so they can find the Holy Grail. And they have to meet with the local potentate, right? The local leader of this nation to get his support, because a lot, these are complex logistical undertakings. You can't just walk into foreign countries and do whatever you want. It's not going to happen. Even if they are militarily inferior to you, still they're going to harass you, withdraw support. You won't be able to find donkeys, food, water, laborers. They can deny you all that. The weapons of the weak. You have to get permission and active cooperation. They have to say yes to what you want. So you have to offer something in return. Anyone remember this scene? This is the scene where the Nazis actually start off by saying, in exchange for your logistical support for our expedition, we will give you this chest full of gold and amulets and crowns, like real wealth. And this guy over here, the leader of the Republic of Hatay, he actually says, "I don't want that. That's just crude, crass money. I want this Rolls Royce." And he says, "It's even the color I like." And the Nazis immediately say, "Oh, yes, we will give you the Rolls Royce in exchange for your help." Right? Classic compensations, not of plunder, because it's not regarded as plunder in this day and age. We put that valuation on later. It's regarded as the compensations of cooperation. Diplomatic capital, political capital, social capital, or economic capital, depending on the social class and economic standing of the person who is receiving the compensation. Now, let's get to the ugly side of all this. I know by this point you're thinking, "God, Professor Jacobs, you're such a reactionary sellout. You're just an apologist for imperialists. I can't believe the result of all your research is that you're actually putting these imperialists in a positive light and, sort of explaining why they were able to do and why it wasn't theft." All right. There is an ugly side to all of this as well. We will openly acknowledge it. Rampant racism and Eurocentrism. Let's start with anthropometry. Anthropometry, sort of related to the science of phrenology, both discredited sciences. Okay, they are outgrowths of what is known as social Darwinism. The idea that there are a distinct number of races in this world. These races rise and fall through miscegenation, mixing with inferior races. And when a superior race mixes with an inferior race, it brings the whole civilization down. All right? And oftentimes, they would use this explicitly or implicitly as their criteria for determining which civilizations were worthy of being studied and which were not, and how civilizations rise and fall. Ancient India has great ruins because the ancient Aryan race was superb. And then they mixed with the inferior, darker-skinned peoples of the South Asian subcontinent, and that brought the whole civilization low, and that's why they are a colonized people today. Ancient Egypt was great, and then they mixed with inferior racial stock, and now the Arabs have fallen low, and we have to come in and restore their lost and faded glory. All right, anthropometry was seen as a quote-unquote scientific method to determine how these races have mixed with one another, to what degree they might have traces of admired ancient Western races like the Greeks. And, this is how you did it. You would use this measurements of various facial features, skull, cranial features to determine these people's place on the evolutionary scale of civilization. And they're always looking for traces of ancient Greeks usually. And oftentimes they would follow sort of the expeditions of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. And they would say, wherever Alexander the Great conquered in the Middle East and in Central Asia, you're going to find evidence where his soldiers settled down with the local people, mixed with them. So let's go in and find traces of the ancient Greeks in the cranial features of the descendants of these populations. And they would often explicitly say, this group, this mountain tribe retains more Greek features, and thus they would be admired more. They would be seen as a more advanced tribe than those that did not evince Greek features. So this was the science of anthropometry. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into the archives of various Western explorers, and you see entire boxes filled with note cards. You take out the note cards. One on one side is sort of a mugshot. It's like a police mugshot of the person. Sometimes multiple ones. You have a side view, a front view. Down like this. All this sort of stuff, and then all these statistics about measurement of this, measurement of this, measurement of this. It makes your skin crawl to see this. It's like they're insects in a laboratory. And the end goal of this is quite morally odious, to determine who is a superior representative of civilization and who is inferior, who has risen high, who has risen low. And obviously, the white people are imagined to be on top. These views oftentimes infuse the way that Western archaeologists interpreted what they found on the ground. The German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq, who went to northwestern China several times for his excavations, we have this wonderful example in his published book about his expeditions, seen here on the bottom right, he actually describes this Buddhist torso from the city of Turfan, or the suburbs of Turfan, where he excavated it. He sees this as indicative of what is referred to as Gandharan art. Gandharan art. Art that represents a fusion of the descendants of Alexander the Great and local Central Asian populations. And therefore, it's something to be admired because you can see traces of the ancient Greeks, right? Listen to how he describes this in the text of his book. We're talking about this Buddhist torso on the right side. He says, quote, "The drapery falls in noble lines, not yet degraded by Eastern Asiatic misunderstandings of classic forms." There is your ugly gloss on full display. Today, we would say, this is a wonderful example of cultural fusion, right? The mixing of different cultures. Isn't this remarkable? You have a little bit of Greek, you have a little bit of Central Asian, and some Buddhism in there and whatnot. This is fantastic. He says, no, it's only fantastic to the extent that it has preserved evidence of ancient Greek craftsmanship. Anything else is a deviation from the ideal. All right? It is an Eastern Asiatic misunderstanding, not reinterpretation, misunderstanding of classic forms. All right? In fact, remember Ellsworth Huntington? The primary purpose of his expedition, his expedition to illustrate economic capital, why the masses, the Muslim peasants engaged his expedition, because he was provided multiple forms of economic capital. What was the purpose of his expedition? He was trying to find evidence for the effects of climate on the rise and fall of races. This is why races rise and fall, because of climate. Where did he find all evidence for where the best, most robust races are going to flourish? Surprise, surprise, Northern Europe and North America. Wherever there were white people, lo and behold, he found evidence where historical climate data patterns had showed that, oh yes, this is what produces the best races on Earth. Anywhere where people were living in poverty and politically disunited, lo and behold, he found evidence that ancient climate data had predetermined all of this. All right, so pretty nefarious intellectual agendas. Absolutely. Oral Stein, I don't want to exempt him from any of this sort of disgraceful stuff either. He was a committed believer in these racist theories. Here is a quote from one of his letters. It says, quote, "I entirely agree with you in your opinion about the effect of such a climate on the mentality of races which have suffered from it for untold generations." He's writing to his friend Reginald Schomburg. "Of course, those who have inherited the result cannot be blamed for it, but it is a pity that they are not plainly told of what their shortcomings are and what these are due to it." All right? It's not their fault. It's not the fault of all these other people who are helping him on his expedition that they have inherited a degraded racial mentality and abilities. It's not their fault. But wouldn't it be nice if we could educate them so they realize why they're inferior to us and why we're the ones in power and they're not? We should, definitely make some efforts to teach them that so they realize why they are subordinate to us. Then there was blatant Eurocentrism, right? Anything to be respectable from the ancient past had to somehow be linked to the preferred narrative of Western civilization, which usually begins with the Greeks, goes to the Romans, and people they have contact with. You have to link it to this preferred narrative of Western civilization for something from the ancient past to be respectable. Egyptian art originally was not seen as connected to the Greeks. Excuse me. Originally, Egyptian art was seen as something that before the hieroglyphs were deciphered in 1822 by the French scholar Jean-Francois Champollion, before they could read the ancient hieroglyphs, they didn't realize that the history of ancient Egypt intersected so closely with the history of the Greeks, with the history of the Hebrew Bible. And once they deciphered the hieroglyphs, all of a sudden they realized, whoa, Egypt interacted with our preferred lineage of Western civilization all the time. Therefore, they claimed it for Western civilization. And Egypt then became a part of this narrative of Western civilization because they could link it to the Greeks. And they even said, it's clear now that Egypt is a precursor to the Greeks. And many of the accomplishments the Egyptians did, they then bequeathed to the Greeks. All right, Eurocentrism, to be admired, to be respected, somehow you have to be linked to the preferred cherry-picked narrative of the history of Western civilization. The ruins of Mesoamerica, Mayan monuments, were said to be refugees from the Greeks' sunken island of Atlantis. They were said to be perhaps Egyptians or Romans who were blown off course. Maybe they were built by the lost tribes of Israel. Anything to link them to a Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian lineage. But it couldn't possibly be the locals. It couldn't possibly be the ancestors of these guys. No way that they built this stuff. Only someone who is somehow linked to Westerners, our preferred definition of who a Westerner is, could have possibly built something so magnificent. Unfortunately, the fourth film, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, actually adopted a similar approach. I don't think necessarily intentionally, again, sort of regurgitating some unconscious bias. But in the fourth film, the Crystal Skull, this is the skull of an alien. And the film actually then suggests that the great monuments of South America were built by aliens. Because, of course, the uncivilized local savages couldn't possibly have built this stuff. They had to be assisted by either Westerners or extraterrestrial life forms. All right, just a very denigrating gloss on the history of South America. And then also there was espionage. Espionage under the cloak of science. All right, originally, archaeologists always did mapping of the lands they went through. They collected local intelligence of the lands they went through. And when they got back home, they reported all of these things. They handed all of their documents over to their military colleagues. This was standard practice. In their eyes, they were thinking, there's nothing wrong with this because my empire is benevolent. We will only do good things with this data because they had blinders on their eyes, of course, and they thought that anything that their empire does is going to be for positive. All archaeologists did this. They all collected what we would refer to today as intelligence about the lands through which they passed, handed them back to their military colleagues back home, and this stuff could be used for military applications in the future. One of the most infamous was during World War I. The American archaeologist Sylvanus Morley agreed to work for the Office of Naval Intelligence and go to the coastline of Central America and scout out the possibility that the Germans could create submarine bases for their U-boats that could potentially shoot ships in American waters. And he explicitly did this under the cover of being a Mayan archaeologist. He was a Mayan archaeologist, but he went to the Mexican authorities on the pretext that he was doing an archaeological expedition, and it was purely scholarly in nature. What he really did was do undercover intelligence espionage for the American military authorities. And this was widespread. He's not the only guy. Afterwards, the anthropologist Franz Boas, a German American, criticized this practice. He learned of it and he says, "This is the prostitution of science. This is not okay." And he was savagely attacked and kicked out of the American Association of Anthropology, and said to be disloyal to America for daring to criticize that archaeologists were undertaking espionage work during World War I. When did it all come to an end? When did it all come to an end? When do we get to an era in which things are not going across borders anymore and are largely staying at home? As you're seeing here, the headdress of Tutankhamun in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. All right. The answer: when the perceived value of the artifacts targeted for removal began to outweigh the compensations of cooperation among the local elites. That's your answer. In other words, once the value of the artifact became greater than the value of the relationship with the resourceful agent of modernization, i.e., the archaeologist, you get resistance to the removal of these artifacts. Okay? 3 things contributed to the devaluation of the compensations of cooperation. All right? The first was non-Western museums. Surprisingly, it doesn't take long before you get non-Western museums. Museums run in the outside of Europe by the locals. 1846, just one generation after the first Napoleon and Giovanni Belzoni and Lord Elgin are in Egypt and Athens, the Ottoman Empire, doing their expeditions, removing stuff. The Ottomans also decide to create their own museums. Here they have mannequins of the Janissaries, military caste. Their whole point of this museum was to demonstrate to Western visitors that we too progress through time. We are not a static Oriental despot. We evolve over time just like the Westerners do. And what they did was they created these mannequins of this military caste that had only recently been deposed and suppressed and had become sort of a relic of history. And they put them on display to show we've moved beyond this. We no longer have a military caste like this anymore. It seems like a strange museum to us, but the whole point was to show that we too move through time. We change. Because the Westerners often said, you guys don't change. You are stagnant. You exist in a state of Oriental stagnation. And they wanted to show that they didn't. 1863, the Bulak Museum. This is a local Egyptian museum in Cairo. And then eventually, the Forbidden City will be turned into the National Palace Museum. That's a little bit later. All the expeditions, all the stuff that happens in China is a little bit later than the Middle East because it's much farther away. But eventually they too will be creating their own national museums. You have to have national museums in the host country to be able to say, we too undertake scientific work. We preserve these things for the education of the general public and as symbols of our nation. It's a crucial ingredient to sort of cultivate a local class of intellectuals who are going to start resisting the Westerners and say these things should be staying in our museums back home. And the political value of that is more than the compensations that you previously offered to local elites. All right. You also have to have Westernized local intellectuals. All right, like this guy, Osman Hamdi Bey, seen here in the 1870s doing archaeological work. Where do these men come from? Usually they are going to be educated abroad in Western institutions of education, usually universities. All right. Or they will be the students of Westerners who come to their host countries and teach them in the host countries. This means that because they have received a Western education, they're going to be trained to regard artifacts as the priceless emblems of the nation or nations that constitute their own state. In other words, once they become Westernized and thus share the ideological assumptions of the priceless value of the artifact, once they subscribe to that, they're going to start resisting the removal of these artifacts from their country because they too now see it as priceless. Here you have Osman Hamdi Bey, again, always earlier in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Here are your Westernized Chinese intellectuals who begin to resist Western expeditions in the 1920s in China. The third element you have to have here, the third ingredient, is you need some sort of political rupture with the imperial past. You need to create a need for a new national identity that is rooted in the symbols of a newly conceived nation. You need a clean break through revolution or war and political dismemberment. You need some way of having a break with your previous imperial past and its crippling dependency on the Western empires. The catalyst for this is usually war or revolution. In the Middle East, it was World War I. There is a map that I had commissioned to show sort of excavations in the Middle East and the countries that will emerge from the Ottoman Empire after the war is over. The Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria, and as losers of the war, they said they suffered the same fate. Just like Germany lost its overseas colonies, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered by the victors into various constituent parts. All right. Each one of the new states that were forcibly created by the victors, Britain and France mainly, all of a sudden say, whoa, we need a brand new source of identity for our new state. Okay. And they've got westernized local elites, westernized Egyptian elites, westernized Turkish elites. They have their own national museums. And they say, now we also need a brand new identity that gives us a connection with our nation, and we can convince the subjects that we rule over that we respect their nation, we protect their nation, and we educate them about our nation. Well, now all of a sudden you can see archaeological artifacts are going to be quite priceless, right? Far more valuable than a relationship with the Western archaeologist and the compensations he previously offered in exchange for your assistance. Okay, and what you see here is that in the Middle East, the fully independent states will start to push back first. Egypt and Turkey in the 1920s will be the first true obstruction of Western archaeological expeditions. Turkey will actually sort of have a halfway ground first. In 1921, you'll have what's known as the culmination of the Sardis affair. Sardis, you can see it on the map right here, is an archaeological site in which Americans under Howard Butler, an archaeologist at Princeton University, were undertaking excavations prior to World War I into the ancient material remains of the past in Sardis. During World War I, they had to stop the excavations, put everything in storage, and then when after World War I ended and there were wars between Greece and Turkey, which you can see indicated here by the lines going back and forth, these battles were in the vicinity of Sardis, the Americans unilaterally decided to move everything that was in crates to New York, thinking, well, we'll just remove it now, and then we'll negotiate with the Turks later on what's going to happen with this. And they said, when the war was over, the Turks said, are you going to return those crates now? The war is over. And they said, well, we were thinking, how about we just leave them here, and we'll put a little plaque on the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, that says, by generous gift of the Turkish government, this will be great PR for you guys, right? And the Turks say, hell no. These are now seen as symbols of our newly conceived nation, and we are fully independent, no longer in need of any of the compensations that you guys can offer us. We want it all back. The Americans said, oh, please, come on. Surely we can come to some sort of an arrangement. They're thinking they're going to work in the old mode. Surely the Turks are susceptible to some sort of compensation. The Turks say no. And that's all it took, by the way. That's all it took. All the Turks had to say was no. There's no guns involved here. There's no coercion. There's no threat of military invasion. No one invades simply to attain antiquities. The Americans came into Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and dug at Sardis and took things away because the Turks said okay. When the Turks said no, in 1921, the Americans brought it back, and that's exactly what the Turks did. They said, if you don't return those crates to Turkey, every single one of them, no American archaeologist will ever be allowed to come and excavate in Turkey again. And they were serious. Just words. When they said yes, the Westerners could do it. When the Turks said no, it's over. There's no guns involved. And the Americans return it. It works. They just said no. And then the Turks themselves decide whether or not we're going to give you anything. And in the end, they did. But still, they were the ones who were deciding that. Howard Carter, 1923 to 1924. The tomb of Tutankhamun is discovered in November of 1922. Slowly excavated over the course of 1923 and 1924. Things come to a head in 1924, in which essentially the conflict is over. Who controls access to the tomb? They don't even get to the point of deciding where are all the artifacts from Tut's tomb going to go. They are still at the stage of saying, who manages this tomb? Does it belong to Howard Carter? Does it belong to Egypt? Oh, Egypt has gained its independence just a few months before Carter discovers the tomb. Just like Turkey, they're going to decide this is now a symbol of our ancient nation, which we identify with, and we want to convince the people of Egypt that we protect the ancient nation. And so they decide that the tomb belongs to them, not Howard Carter. And the dispute actually is over a guest list. It's over a guest list. Howard Carter is incensed that he has to have all of his list of anyone he wants to invite vetted by the Egyptian government in Cairo. And he says, why do I have to do this? I should be able to operate as we operated in the old days. And the government in Cairo says, forget it. This is not your tomb anymore. It belongs to the Egyptian nation. It's a symbol of our nation. It's priceless for us. Nothing you can offer in compensation can match that priceless valuation anymore. And when he realizes that the Egyptians are just going to keep saying no, there's no guns involved once more, right? They just say no. He storms off in a huffy and leaves Egypt. And the Egyptian government takes over the tomb of Tutankhamun. It's as simple as that. It's minds that had to change, not the disparity in wealth and power. Minds. It's simply the desire to say no because we value this differently than our ancestors used to value that. In the Middle East, the obstruction of Western archaeologists a little bit later, usually the late 1920s, sometimes the 1930s. Some of the states are what are known as mandates, mandate states, in which France and Britain didn't want to grant full independence to all the former territory of the Ottoman Empire. So they created what are known as mandate states. We have a mandate to bring you into the modern world. You're not ready yet. The modern world's too stressful for you. Your democratic institutions aren't advanced enough. We will shepherd you in to the modern world in a semi-colonial state. This was Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq, divided between the French and the British. Those places, you can't really resist them. And you also don't have your own fully independent nation, so you don't have the need to take control of these priceless emblems of your ancient nation. Once those mandates end, resistance immediately resumes. Once the mandate in Iraq ends, the Iraqis immediately start to obstruct Western excavations in Iraq. And the same happens for each part of the Middle East. Iran, a little bit different, not really a formal colony of anyone, also not part of the Ottoman Empire. They do have a revolution in the 1920s, and after their revolution, they too have all three ingredients: national museums, westernized indigenous Iranian elites, and a new state now created by revolution that has a clean break with the imperial past that says we need a new identity. The old imperial identity isn't going to work anymore. We need a new identity. It's going to be rooted in the material remains of the ancient past. And one of the first examples of real obstruction comes at Persepolis, an old Achaemenid site from the 6th and 5th century BC. When some German-American archaeologists uncover the gold and silver foundation tablets from the ancient palace at Persepolis, this is when the Iranians make their stand, and they say, this is not going to be leaving our country. Do they take the German-American archaeologist at gunpoint and say, there's no way you're leaving, and they have an Indiana Jones battle? No, they don't. They simply say no. Whereas in the old days, they said yes. That's the difference. In China, the real change begins in 1911. It's a revolution. It's not dismemberment like with the Ottoman Empire. You have a 1911 revolution, and this is also the same time that you get your first generation coming of age that has received a Western education. You have your national museum. The Forbidden City will be changed into a national museum called the National Palace Museum. Once literally forbidden to the Chinese people, now it's seen as an emblem of the Chinese people. A complete ideological overhaul. This was once the exclusive preserve of the ruling elite. It's not yours. It's not an emblem of you. It's not a symbol of the Chinese nation. It's ours to, hey, this represents the entire Chinese nation. It's going to be the foundation of our new identity, the Forbidden City. And this also leads in the 1920s to the first obstruction of foreign archaeologists. Remember, we talked about Roy Chapman Andrews, Langdon Warner. These are the first people to be obstructed in China. Roy Chapman Andrews in particular, here he is looking very debonair with his gun and everything on a dig in Inner Mongolia. Roy Chapman Andrews had one of the more memorable and also pig-headed responses when he was faced with demand to leave his artifacts that he had excavated behind in China. He said, if we were to submit to your demands and let you have everything that we've excavated, we might as well just change the name of our expedition from the Central Asiatic Expedition to Roy's Charity Organization. There you have it. We are not a charity organization. If we can't take things back to our museum, then what is the point of doing an expedition? We want things for our museum. That's where the prestige accrues to it. right? The Chinese will so fully embrace the view of the ancient material remains of the past representing, embodying the new Chinese nation, not just the exclusive individual virtue and preserve of the ruling elite. They will so fully embrace this that they will take the treasures of the imperial city on a 10,000-mile odyssey throughout the interior of China to keep them out of the hands of the Japanese when they invade Beijing in the 1930s. Throughout World War II, they will take them into the interior of China and put them in caves in the mountains to protect them from bombing raids. And then eventually, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government will take the cream of the crop over with him to Taiwan, and they will build a new National Palace Museum that resembles the Forbidden City in many ways, because this is their claim to be the sole legitimate leader of China. We protect the patrimony, the priceless patrimony of the Chinese people. This represents you, not just the ruling elite. Again, another example of fully embracing the Western priceless valuation of the artifact. Now, this chronology from Napoleon to the sort of, the 1920s and 30s obstruction brings us full circle to Hollywood. And now we're going to end with sort of a reflection on Hollywood versus history. How realistic, I should have put this up here a minute ago. This is a map that I had drawn up to show the route of the Forbidden City treasures being moved. Look at this, this is incredible. All the way to Shanghai, 3 different routes to the interior, then back to Nanjing, and then finally after the Chinese Civil War, many of them taken to the island of Taiwan as well. How realistic are the Indiana Jones films? Here's some storyboard art done early on. Well, as we already noted, 1936 is far too late for him to have free reign to do as he wishes in Egypt. Howard Carter was obstructed by 1924. So 1936, no way. You can't have the digs that you see in that movie where you have enormous groups of Nazis and hired Egyptian laborers having pretty much full control over what they're doing. No way that's happening in 1936. It's also too late to snatch that golden idol from Peru either. Hiram Bingham, the discoverer or the Western discoverer of Machu Picchu, had to sign an agreement when he discovered Machu Picchu in 1911. He had to sign an agreement with the Peruvian government that if the Peruvian government ever asked for the objects that he removed from Machu Picchu back, Yale, who he worked for, would have to give them back. And they did eventually ask for it. And Yale did eventually find themselves legally obligated to give these things back to Peru. That is to say, Peru, by 1911, already also subscribed to the new ideals that these represent the priceless patrimony of our nation. And thus they are priceless and Westerners can't remove them. And if they do, we retain the right to ask for them back. And that's exactly what Peru would do. Now, as for the Nazi plot, the Nazis in the first film and the third film, those don't work either, I'm sorry to say. The Nazi leadership, we actually know, it's not a big mystery what they thought of the ancient past. We know what their biases were, and neither of them are reflected in the Indiana Jones films. The Nazi leadership was split along 2 ideological lines with regard to art and antiquities. All right, first there was Hitler. Hitler, there's nothing mysterious about his interest in art and antiquities. He was a typical European elite infatuated with the Greek and Roman past, like pretty much all European intellectuals and scholars and monarchs before him. He's utterly typical in this regard. Then there is Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler, who formed a new organization. I don't know how to pronounce this. I've tried before. I never studied German. Aknenerby, I know that's not how you pronounce it. Something from the ancestors, something inherited from the ancestors. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, he had a different way of looking at the ancient past. He valorized what he referred to as a Nordic branch of the Aryan race. And he sent expeditions to remote areas of Scandinavia to collect folklore and ruins, ancient runes, R-U-N-E-S, not ruins, but runes, ancient runes throughout Europe and the Near East, thinking that this was evidence of the ancient Nordic branch of the Aryan race, which was the superior race, and that the ancient Romans were actually, ancient Nordic Aryans. Hitler laughed at Himmler's agenda. He thought it was absurd. Nevertheless, Himmler actually even undertook an expedition to Tibet in 1938 and 1939 to see if he could track the common, what he believed, the common Aryan origins of Europeans and elite Chinese and Japanese. That's the science of anthropometry once more. That eventually led him into Tibet, was as far as the Nazi expedition under Himmler was able to get. The whole time Hitler was thinking, this is ridiculous. The ancient Germans that Himmler is valorizing were in no way superior to the ancient Romans. They were two different branches. We were still living in mud huts when the Parthenon was being created in ancient Greece. So those are the two poles, the ends of the spectrum of what Nazi leadership thought of art and antiquities and what they valued. Okay. What none of the Nazi leadership were into, however, were the cultures represented by the artifacts in the first and third films. All right. They were very hostile to Christianity. And they were obviously also very hostile to Judaism. Right? That's just common sense, right? It makes no sense that they would believe in the power of, much less chase after, the Hebrew Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail of Christ. That's Judaism and Christianity. They're very hostile to both of these. To be much more accurate, to really reflect the ideological priorities of Nazi leadership, they should have titled it The Raiders of the Lost Colosseum or Indiana Jones and the Last Olympiad, or the Indiana Jones and the Finland Witches of Scandinavia. Or maybe they should have recreated that expedition to Tibet. That's historically accurate. It doesn't make any sense to be going after Jewish and Christian artifacts and truly believing in the power of these artifacts. Give me a break. So what does all this leave us with? What is the most plausible part of the opening scene, or the first film, Raiders of the Lost Ark? Remember, 1936, outruns an oversized boulder, snatches the golden idol from Peru, and beats the Nazis to the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt. No, 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 no. The only thing that's remotely plausible is the boulder. The boulder! How depressing is that? How very sad that the boulder is the most plausible element of the first film. How sad is that? How could Lucas and Spielberg be so ignorant of all of this? Well, the answer is simple. I don't want to get on the bandwagon of beating them down. They're filmmakers. They weren't historians. And it's our fault for thinking that they should be historians. They're not historians. All right? We actually know what went into the thought process of the Indiana Jones film. There was a leaked brainstorming transcript of a session between George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Larry Kasdan from 1978, in which they sit around a tape recorder and they discuss their ideas for this film. Later on, it was leaked and transcribed. And we get to learn over 125 pages where all their inspirations and ideas came from for the Indiana Jones film franchise. The brainstorming sessions, not once in 125 pages of transcribed text do any of these filmmakers mention the name of a single real-life archaeologist. Not once will you see the name of Howard Carter, James Henry Breasted, Giovanni Belzoni, Heinrich Schliemann, Oral Stein. Forget about it. I guarantee they don't have a clue who any of these people are. Don't waste your time guessing who they based Indiana Jones off of, because they don't know the name of a single one of them. If they had, they easily could have come up with a more historically grounded plot. All right. Indiana Jones films are great fun, but there is zero history involved in those films. Anything that represents a similarity to actual real-life archaeological expeditions is pure coincidence, or the regurgitation, the inadvertent regurgitation of popular cultural stereotypes, the sort of ugly stuff that the archaeologists also shared and are just still floating in the ether of mainstream culture at the time that they're coming up with this film. That's how it gets in there. That's it. You read the I actually have a much more in-depth analysis of this in a podcast episode, Hollywood versus History, or did Hollywood get it right? I forget what I called it. I've got a book, Indiana Jones and History. The last chapter, I dissect this in minute detail, and you can learn about what their real inspirations were. It's previous Hollywood productions, James Bond, Clark Gable, John Wayne. They say it's going to be like Disneyland rides, Ripley's Believe It or Not. They're living in the world of Hollywood and popular culture, as they should. They're filmmakers. They're not historians. It's our mistake for assuming that Hollywood filmmakers would be injecting real history into the film. And they don't. So don't think that Indiana Jones is based on any historical figure, because it's not. There's one other troubling issue unrelated to historical politics, and that's gender. Each film has a major female lead, co-lead, who tends to be just as tough as Indy, with the exception of the second film, in which Kate Capshaw was widely sort of panned for her damsel in distress, over-the-top damsel in distress. But otherwise, the films are usually lauded for saying, hey, these are pretty strong female leads who can hold their own and are a challenge and a match for Indiana Jones, while also being able to serve as a romantic figure. All right. Great for cinema, but is there any analog in history? Well, surprisingly, yes. Despite many lifelong bachelors, Oral Stein was a lifelong bachelor, there were some archaeologists who took their wives along. And that's usually how you get women into historical archaeological expeditions. If you see them there, if they're playing a major role, they tend to be the wives of more prominent male archaeologists who went with their husbands into the field. Leonard Woolley, Flinders Petrie, both in Egypt and the Near East, they both worked alongside their wives, and their wives left accounts. And sometimes the wives could assume quite prominent roles in these excavations as well. The best cinematic analog, probably, if you were trying to think of a film and what sort of women could serve a strong female co-lead, is probably Giovanni Belzoni. Giovanni Belzoni, he was Italian, but he married an English woman, Sarah Belzoni. She was a rope dancer in the theater. They got married, and she accompanied with him on his expeditions to Egypt in 1815 to 1816. And she left her own account as well. It's probably one of the earliest expeditions you're going to find in which you can do all the things that Indiana Jones wants to do with relative impunity, and you've got a strong female partner in the mix who goes along for the expedition. If you're looking for the best historical basis for Indiana Jones-like film, it would have to be based on the expeditions of Giovanni and Sarah Belzoni. However, again, though, the brainstorming session transcript kind of sullies what we might assume is a progressive aspect of the film. That is to say, Marion Ravenwood. Remember her? She's in two of the films, the first one and the fourth one. And she's seen as the toughest of all the female leads, and usually the one who gets the most respect. You may not be aware of how she was originally discussed. They discussed her sexuality, her age, and her relationship to Indiana Jones. Here is the verbatim what was said about Marion Ravenwood from the brainstorming transcript. Lucas, I was thinking that this old guy could have been his mentor. He could have known this little girl when she was just a kid, had an affair with her when she was 11, and he was Larry Kasdan, and he was 42. Lucas, he hasn't seen her in 12 years. Now she's 22. It's a real strange relationship. Hasn't seen her in 12 years. Now she's 22. That means she was 10. Spielberg, he realizes, he does the math in his head and realizes something's wrong. She had better be older than 22, right? Lucas, all right, he's 35. And he knew her 10 years ago when he was 25 and she was only 12. Yeah, 12 better than 10. What, 12? Kasdan, it would be amusing to make her slightly young at the time. Spielberg, and promiscuous. She came on to him. Lucas, 15 is right on the edge. I know it's an outrageous idea, but it is interesting. Once she's 16 or 17, it's not interesting anymore. But if she was 15 and he was 25 and they actually had an affair the last time they met and she was madly in love with him and Spielberg interrupts, she has pictures of him. This is creepy. This is creepy. What they're discussing is what is legally defined as statutory rape. A 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, my God. And it actually leaves a legacy that you may not capture, that they may not catch in the first film. In this scene, in the bar in Nepal that she owns, when Indiana Jones first shows up, they have a conversation. And Marion says, and it's out of context, so most people have no idea what they're talking about. With the brainstorm, you have the context. She says, I was just a child then. And he says gruffly, you knew what you were doing. Yeah. Out of context, you're like, okay, what are they talking about? Metaphorically, she was a child, right? No, you read the brainstorming transcript, these ideas about gender that were going into there are quite ugly and misogynist as well. She was literally a child. They were trying to make her promiscuous. Thank God at some later stage in the revision process, someone came in, some producer or whatever came in and said, all right, guys, you got serious issues here. This cannot make it to the final cut. But this line was still a relic of that. Okay, we're going to end there. All right, this is sort of your introduction to Meet the Real Indiana Jones. And I hope that all of this has given you some sense of how archaeological expeditions in history actually worked, and also a sense of what went into the films and how far Hollywood departs from actual history. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you.